Hey, it's Ben from the Lumberbin Company. Today I'm going to show you how to make a simple router table with stuff you have laying around the shop, and we're going to attach it to our existing table saw, and then we're going to retrofit it to our dust collection system. So without further ado, here we go. Alright, so you're going to want to get yourself some 3/4 inch plywood. I had some laying in the shop already. The dimensions for this particular table saw are 27 by 14, and I'm going to show you how to deal with the 1.5 in just a moment here. We're going to start off and we're going to just cut our plywood to size. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. I've got lots of really interesting content that I think everyone will like coming up in the future. From here, what we're going to do is find our center. This is where the bit is going to come out of the plywood. Our entire project is going to be based around this. For me, I chose 6.5 inches from the edge, dead center, so 27 inches divided by 2. And I chose the 6.5 inches to consider the router plate from underneath when we go to install it. Make ssure that you mark the entire length of the plywood here. It'll come in handy later. And use a square to get your horizontal line. So just base it off your first line, get your second line going, and then you're just going to mark all of your holes, which you're going to transfer directly from the router plate. You'll notice that the screws that came with the router are no longer long enough. So take one to the hardware store with you. I think you're going to be, for me it was a number 10 screw, and I used 1.5 inches. And that worked just fine. We're also going to use countersink holes to make sure that they're at least flush with the surface so that they're not poking out. So for myself here, I think I've decided I'm going to stay flush with the extension table. I think that's what makes the most sense. Also, it'll increase stability when I'm working with bigger pieces in the future. I wanted to double check that if I doubled up on the plywood, that it would line up correctly. And here, it was pretty bang on. Alright, so I'm going to cut some 3/4 inch strips. You'll see that I actually only cut 2 strips. You're going to want to cut 3. You'll see a little bit later in the video. I actually forgot to do the back piece right there that you'll see. So make sure you just cut 3 strips. Get yourself some glue and apply it properly. And then we're going to screw it. It'll ensure that we never have to deal with this again in the future. Since it's in the frame, it's a good idea not to keep your snowblower in your shop while you're working. I went to use it one day and it didn't start, so I had it sent to a small engine mechanic, and he told me that the intake was completely bogged with sawdust. So just something to keep in mind. And that also kind of gets you thinking about wearing a mask. I have a semi-legitimate dust collection system, and even with that, I have no idea how that much dust ended up in my snowblower. So it just gets you thinking, always wear a mask. Okay, so we're looking pretty good here. I'm going to dry fit it just to make sure everything is snug as a bug. And then once we're good on that, we're going to take the screws that we went to get from the hardware store, and you can go ahead and fasten the router plate and base to the unit. Around here, I started noticing too that if you guys really want, you can actually snug in your base and plate a little bit closer to the edge. So like I said earlier in the video, I used 6.5 inches. You could do 5 or 4.5 if you wanted to with no problem. It'll give you more working surface once the fence is on. The choice is yours. So there's that 3rd strip that we forgot earlier. I'm a big fan of physical representation, so I'm going to use some clamps and I'm going to fasten them to the fence rail, and that's going to allow me to work the table, make sure that it's all flush and level. While there's nothing wrong with these yellow clamps, I decided to use my really good C-clamps, and it's going to allow me to really tighten them against the fence rail and to get 0 movement while I'm fastening this into place. When possible, make sure that you're drilling from out to in to make sure that your hole is as straight as possible. You'll notice here that I have a piece of wood on the top clamped down, putting pressure downwards onto the C-clamp. This is to make sure that while I'm drilling, it can't move up or down. I think it's also worth mentioning not to tighten all of your bolts all the way until all your bolts are actually in. Now that the table is fastened to the table saw, we're going to make our hole into our table. So with the actual unit sitting into the base just enough so it doesn't fall out on its own, you're going to turn it on and start to turn it slowly until you create a hole. And I want to reiterate how careful everyone should be here during this step. All you need is to be sent to the hospital because you thought that the actual unit was in the base when it wasn't. So we're going to start to make our fence here. I'm going to use mine using oak. You do not have to use oak. It's complete overkill. The 3/4 inch plywood is just fine. You're going to cut 2 pieces. I'm doing mine at 32 inches. And this is going to leave enough room on both sides to clamp it down. And right in the dead center of my fence, I'm going to make a 2-inch cutout to make room for the actual bit, as well as for the dust collection system that I'm going to make for it. So again, oak here being complete overkill. Luckily I had a fairly sharp blade for my crappy little jigsaw to cut this out. You would have a way easier time doing this if you were using plywood, obviously. Luckily it still worked out okay. You don't see it in the video, but underneath you can see the blade was actually completely deflected during this. So it is what it is. It's not a big deal. Okay, so we're getting a first glimpse at what the idea is here. Me being a huge fan of physical representation, I'm just getting the height that I need for my blocks here, which I'll show you in a second. And then I'm going to use that distance to set my rip fence against the blade. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rip the piece through. And these are going to be the blocks I'm going to use to fasten the 2 pieces of the fence together. I initially cut my blocks with my miter. I didn't like the result. The one thing you have to get bang on here is these blocks have to be square. So I decided to use my CROSSCUT SLED. I'm sorry that it's a little bit outside of the scope of this video. Jonathan KATZ-MOSES has a wicked video on how to make a really good CROSSCUT SLED. I'll be sure to include a link in the description. And then these blocks are going to be perfect. With all that said, there's a number of ways that you can achieve square without the use of a CROSSCUT SLED. You could use a combo square, you could use a triangle, you could measure on your table saw between the rip fence and the blade itself, at the beginning of the blade and the back of the blade. If they're both exact, you know that when you rip your piece through, it's going to be bang on. So just to keep all that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to measure, so I have a 32-inch board and there are 4 blocks going in, so 32 divided by 5 is roughly 6.5 inches apart. I measured mine for 2 on each side from both ends so that my remainder is towards the center. So here I am being a complete fanatic of physical representation. If you haven't figured it out yet, I am a bit of a sucker for symmetry and all things perfect. I realize that this is a Ben issue, but hey, what can I say? And if you've never used one of these, I highly recommend it. It's a carbide countersink drill bit with a low friction depth stop. I highly recommend it. The bit is going to snap almost right away, of course, but who cares? You're going to use your own, but the depth stop is quite good. Okay, now that that's done, we're going to do some dry fitting. Here I want to make sure everything is perfectly square. So I want to make sure my blocks are square. And then once I have that, I'm going to drill holes inside of my blocks. And then we're going to glue everything together. I didn't show it, but make sure that you're checking square on all 4 blocks in each of the 4 places where they're going to go. If you're comfortable with everything here so far, fast forward to 11 minutes. Okay, so welcome back. So now we're going to glue the actual fence to the blocks and to the base of the fence. We're only going to use glue here. I didn't want to use any screws because a screw could deflect the fence inwards. So we're going to use high quality glue and we're not going to have a problem here. This is excellent glue. So I know that we're going to be just fine. We're going to clamp it properly and we're going to check for square at all the blocks again while we're clamping it to make sure that it's perfect everywhere. That is crucial. Okay, now remember that also while you're doing this, you're not gonna necessarily reef on your clamps, especially C clamps. They are really powerful, so you're gonna be careful. All you're looking for is a snug fit and to make sure that they're square. Once that's done, I'm just checking to make sure there's no deflection in the wood. It's oak, so I knew that it was unlikely. I thought it was still worth checking just to be sure. I'm going to add a couple clamps here as well, just to make sure that the base is snug to the fence. And then we're going to wait for it to dry at least 3 hours. Also, try to do your best to account for everything in your project right from the beginning. I decided halfway through I was going to add a port for the dust collection, and what do you know? It doesn't fit. So now I am stuck jimmy rigging this. Luckily, I have a miter that I'm going to use to cut the sides, and I've got some fast-acting putty that I'm going to use to fasten it to the inside of the fence. Here I'm just cutting my quick connect fitting that was too long, and I'm going to plug this into my existing dust collection system on my table saw. And this was a 2.5 inch fitting with the 2.5 inch Forstner bit. That Forstner bit was actually pretty bang on. I didn't actually have to use this putty here, I just wanted to, but I found that the fitting was pretty snug. So after both sides were cut, I had a pretty decent fit. Everything was pretty snug as a bug. This putty doesn't stay malleable for very long, so make sure that you're using it in small amounts. You'll see in the video that this is giving me a hard time, so just something to keep in mind if you do go through this route. You can also use countersunk holes. Just make sure that you have the pilot holes drilled just to make sure that the wood doesn't deflect. The putty's adhesion is actually really good once it dries. It's not very good when it's still malleable, but once it was dry, I was impressed at how well it held together. After 3 hours, you can take off the clamps here. I wanted to make sure that there was no dry glue underneath between the base and the fence, so I'm just going to sand it here and make sure it's nice and flush. Okay, so here we go. So this is pretty much done. You don't have to take this any further if you don't want to. The clamps are holding it just fine. It's fully functional as is. We're plugging it into our existing dust collection system, and it works very well. Just make sure that the caster is off the ground when you run this for the first time. And as you can see, the result is actually quite good. I was super impressed at how it turned out. I'm just going to make it a little bit deeper to make it more obvious here so you can see it better in the video. And voila. So as I was saying, this is pretty much done. You don't have to take this any further unless you're me. I'm going to add some dovetail guideways for some bolts that I'm going to use to fasten to the fence and then tighten with some knobs. And that way I don't have to bother with the clamps anymore. I started off with a depth of 1/4 inch, but I found that the opening, the throat, was too big. Although the screw fit just fine, I felt like maybe I should be going a little bit deeper. This time around I tried 3/8. And the screw fit again, although I did find that the integrity of the plywood was slightly compromised. The router being fairly heavy, I didn't want it to buckle the integrity of the plywood over time, so I decided to meet them both in the middle, which was 5/16, which I think was the right call here. I think it was the right depth to protect the integrity of the plywood itself, and also the throat of the dovetail. When I went to tighten the bolt with the knob, I didn't want it popping through. I found the center of my 32-inch board, and I had a 24-inch square, so I literally just marked it right at the ends once I had the center, and I knew that's what I would be using on the table itself. When I found center, I marked it with my combo square, and it doesn't even have to be in the center, to be honest, as long as they're the same on both sides. So you can see here why that center line that we drew at the beginning of this project is coming in handy. So I'm marking it right in the dead center of my square, which is 12 inches, and then literally just marking it at both ends. And I know that that is lining up perfectly with the lines I just made on my fence itself. With my 3 marks made, I can go ahead and draw a straight line now for my dovetail guideways on both sides. If you want to double check that everything is good with your marks, you can go ahead and draw a straight line across the bottom of your fence here, and you can check it against the lines that you've made on your table. Once you're good to go, it's time to drill our holes. I'm doing mine with a mobile drill press, and I'm going to drill it from underneath. I thought that's what was easiest. Check that the bolts fit inside. And once that's done, you can line up your holes with the layout lines on both sides, just to make sure they're lining up in the center on both sides throughout the length of the table. Okay, so for those who are not aware, the fence is on the wrong side, which means the router wants to go to the left here. So you have to be sure to actively push the router to the right. And the reason I did it that way was because I had no clearance on the other side to do it any other way. You'll notice how much easier it is to run the router up when you're doing it on this side rather than the other side, because the router naturally wants to go towards the left. Just make sure you're looking into the router and not to hit the extension table. You can just stop a 1/2 inch before. You don't want to accidentally ruin your bit. I think tightening these will be a little bit of trial and error. You don't have to over tighten here. If you do, you could make grooves that'll make it difficult to tighten in the future. And I think you can solve that problem by using really small washers. But as you can see, I didn't go that direction here. Anyways, that's pretty much it. I'm super happy with the way this worked out, and that I was able to show you guys that you don't have to spend a lot of money or take up any extra space if you're working in close quarters like I am to get going with a router table. The things that you can do now that you have one of these, and like from rabbiting to dados to mortising, tongue and groove, template routing. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do now that you have one of these. So thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for future projects. Thanks, guys.